Imagine waking up one morning to find that your entire family has been taken, parents, children, maybe even extended family members, all abducted from your home in the middle of the night. It's a nightmare that seems impossible, but for many Nigerians living in suburban and peri-urban areas, this is becoming a harsh reality. These aren't isolated cases of individuals being taken for ransom. This is an alarming new trend where entire families, whole households, are being kidnapped in one fell swoop. This shift in tactics is changing the nature of kidnapping in Nigeria. In the past, the majority of abductions targeted specific individuals, wealthy business owners, prominent politicians, or even school children. However, we are now seeing a disturbing rise in the kidnapping of entire families, leaving communities shaken to their core. What was once a crime that could be brushed off as a rare occurrence has now become an epidemic, a terrifying intrusion into the safety and security of everyday family life. No longer is it just the isolated rich or powerful that are targeted, but ordinary families who suddenly find themselves caught in the crosshairs of organized criminal gangs. The scale of the problem is staggering. Kidnapping has grown dramatically in Nigeria, with thousands of people abducted every year. What's more troubling is the fact that many of these kidnappings involve groups, not just individuals. Whole families, sometimes entire neighborhoods, are being torn apart by these violent criminal gangs. This is no longer a localized issue, but one that has spread across various states and regions, with no sign of slowing down. The emotional toll on victims and the communities affected by this is immeasurable, leaving families devastated and society questioning its safety. One of the most alarming factors in this surge of kidnappings is the vulnerability of suburban and peri-urban areas. These areas, while not far from major cities, often lack the same level of security and law enforcement presence. Unlike urban centers where security may be more tightly monitored, suburban and peri-urban neighborhoods are less guarded, leaving them prime targets for criminal gangs. The attackers often exploit the lack of vigilance in these areas, taking advantage of weaker policing and lower awareness of the risks. These communities, who once felt safe behind their gates and walls, are now waking up to the grim reality that even their homes are not safe. They are left feeling exposed, vulnerable, and helpless in the face of a growing crime wave. As we delve deeper into this terrifying trend, we will explore how these kidnappings are taking place, what drives these criminal groups, and the devastating impact on those caught in their wake. This isn't just a story of crime. It's a story of shattered lives, families torn apart, and communities living in fear. This is the reality of family-wide kidnappings in Nigeria today. The way kidnappers operate is chillingly calculated. These criminals know exactly when and how to strike, choosing moments when their targets are most vulnerable. Most often, these kidnappings happen in the dead of night or very early in the morning, when families are still asleep and their guard is down. In the silence of the night, the sound of motorcycles revving or the faintest of footfalls on the ground are often the only signs that something sinister is about to happen. But by the time the family realizes what's occurring, it's already too late. These criminals don't rely on noisy, attention-grabbing methods. Instead, they've perfected the art of moving quietly, swiftly, and undetected. They often use motorcycles or bikes as their primary mode of transport. Vehicles that are fast, easy to maneuver, and capable of getting in and out of neighborhoods quickly. The use of these vehicles allows the kidnappers to avoid detection by the limited security that exists in many suburban and peri-urban areas. In these communities, people often rely on watchmen or basic street surveillance to protect them. But the criminals know exactly how to avoid these measures, striking with speed and precision. The kidnappers don't just target one house or one family. No, they strike multiple homes, sometimes sweeping entire compounds in a single attack. It's a calculated group effort that leads to dozens being abducted at once, leaving the community in complete chaos. With one coordinated effort, the bandits can kidnap men, women, and children, turning what should be a peaceful neighborhood into a scene of terror. The kidnappers move quickly, knowing that the longer they remain in the area, the greater the chance of being caught. What makes these crimes even more devastating is the way victims are bundled together. Imagine the horror of being pulled from your bed in the dead of night, only to find your family torn apart and transported together to an unknown location. Entire families are taken, fathers, mothers, and children, each one terrified, confused, and helpless. The psychological toll is profound, as victims are not just physically abducted, but emotionally shattered by the traumatic experience of being taken in such an intimate, personal way. The end goal for these criminals is, of course, financial gain. Ransom becomes the motive that drives these kidnappings. Once they have their victims in captivity, the kidnappers make their demands. Often, the ransoms are substantial, taking advantage of the emotional bonds that exist within families. It's not just money they are after, it's the emotional pressure they can exert on loved ones. The kidnappers know that a family will do anything, pay anything, to ensure the safe return of their relatives. This manipulation of family ties makes ransom demands particularly effective and, tragically, successful. What's most disturbing is that kidnapping has become a profitable business. The statistics are staggering. Thousands of people are abducted across Nigeria every year, and the sums involved are astronomical. Criminal gangs have turned kidnapping into a lucrative criminal enterprise. The kidnappers don't just take one or two individuals. They target entire families and demand ransoms that can run into millions of naira. It's a business built on fear, suffering, and greed. As the country battles this growing crisis, the kidnappers continue to operate with a frightening level of impunity, turning the emotional devastation of entire families into a source of financial gain. It's a pattern that is repeating across Nigeria, and it shows no signs of slowing down. In the last 12 months alone, the scale of kidnapping across Nigeria has reached shocking proportions. Thousands of abduction cases have been reported, and what was once a relatively isolated problem has now become a nationwide crisis. Kidnapping for ransom has risen to such an extent that it is no longer just a blip on the radar, but a persistent and growing epidemic that is wreaking havoc on families, communities, and the country at large. The numbers are staggering, and the frequency of these crimes has only increased as the year has gone on. While many of the high-profile cases that dominate the news tend to focus on school children or mass school kidnappings, there's a disturbing trend that is growing in the shadows. Kidnappings occurring in villages and peri-urban communities. What was once thought of as a crime affecting only urban areas has now spread to rural and suburban zones, where the safety of entire families is compromised. These aren't just isolated incidents where a few individuals are taken. Now, entire families, parents, children, siblings, and sometimes extended relatives are being abducted in one fell swoop, making the crime even more personal and devastating. In many cases, these families are simply going about their lives, unaware that in the quiet of the night, their homes will be raided, their loved ones torn from them, and their lives turned upside down. This rising wave of abductions isn't confined to just one area of the country. While the Northwest remains heavily affected, with regions like Zamfara, Kaduna, and Kano seeing frequent attacks, the kidnappers' reach has spread far and wide. Kidnapping cases have been reported in southwestern, central, and even eastern Nigeria, showing just how far the rot has spread. The problem is no longer something that affects only the northern parts of the country, but has infected every region, leaving no place untouched by the insecurity that banditry and kidnapping now bring. Communities that once felt safe, even in suburban or rural areas, are now living in constant fear, uncertain of whether their homes will be next. One of the most alarming aspects of this crisis is how organized the kidnappers have become. What was once an opportunistic crime carried out by a few bandits is now a highly structured and organized criminal enterprise. These kidnappers operate with networks and routes, carefully planned to avoid detection and ensure a successful operation. They have developed hideouts in remote forests and abandoned buildings, using these safe havens to store their victims and plan their next moves. These criminal groups have turned kidnapping into a depressing industry, one that is generating millions of naira every year. This kidnap for ransom Business is not just a few isolated criminals working alone, but a sprawling network of people involved in the capture, transportation, and negotiation of ransoms. The fact that kidnapping has evolved into such an organized crime makes it even more difficult to combat. Local law enforcement is often outmatched, with resources stretched thin and no clear way to break the network of criminals that operates across the country. What was once a crime of desperation has now become a well-oiled machine, with kidnappers targeting victims, collecting ransoms, and reinvesting their profits into expanding their operations. The sheer scale of the problem has made it a deeply embedded part of the criminal landscape in Nigeria, and the country is facing a crisis that affects not only the safety of its citizens, but also the very fabric of its society. The effects of these kidnappings stretch far beyond the physical act of abduction. For the families involved, the trauma they experience is nothing short of devastating. Parents who have been torn from their children, children who are ripped away from their homes and their familiar, comforting surroundings, are left in a state of shock and fear. These aren't faceless victims. These are real people, everyday Nigerians who had simple lives, dreams, and plans. Farmers, traders, workers, and small business owners who lived peacefully in suburban or similar areas are now thrust into unimaginable crisis. Imagine a mother waking up to find her children gone, a father forced to leave his home behind as he's dragged away by gunmen. The pain and helplessness felt by these families is indescribable. Their lives, which once had a semblance of normalcy, are now permanently altered. Parents who were once pillars of support for their children now find themselves powerless, unable to protect the ones they love. Children who were once full of hope for the future are now left traumatized, with their innocence stolen in an instant. This trauma doesn't end with the initial abduction. It ripples out into the very fabric of the affected communities. Entire neighborhoods live in constant fear, knowing that no one is safe. What used to be a peaceful suburban or rural existence has turned into a life on the edge, where people no longer feel secure even within the walls of their own homes. Parents no longer sleep soundly at night, constantly alert, waiting for the next attack. The fear of a night raid or the possibility of losing their loved ones keeps them awake, filled with anxiety. Some families, unable to cope with the constant threat, are forced to make the painful decision to leave their homes entirely. Entire communities have been uprooted, with people fleeing to nearby cities or more secure regions in search of safety. What was once a close-knit, functioning society is now scattered and displaced, leaving behind empty homes and abandoned fields. The ripple effects of these kidnappings extend far beyond the families directly involved. Education is one of the first casualties. Children who were once attending school, full of promise and potential, are now unable to continue their studies. Whether because their parents can't afford school fees due to the ransom demands, or because they're simply too traumatized to focus, these children lose their futures. For many, education is the only way out of poverty, and kidnapping robs them of that opportunity, leaving them with little hope for a better tomorrow. Then there is the economic hardship that comes with the aftermath of these kidnappings. Families who are forced to pay ransom are often financially crippled by the demands. Even after paying the ransom, many are left with nothing, no means of livelihood, no savings, and often a sense of betrayal and fear. Those who cannot pay the ransom face the agony of seeing their loved ones remain in captivity, sometimes for months on end. For the families of those who are killed or injured in the process, the economic toll is even greater. The loss of a provider, the death of a breadwinner, or the injury of a key family member leaves families struggling to survive. Psychologically, the scars are deep and long-lasting. Survivors of these abductions, whether they are released after a ransom is paid or rescued in a military operation, often carry trauma that can last for years. The emotional toll on the abducted individuals, especially children, is immeasurable. Many suffer from anxiety, depression, and PTSD, unable to fully recover from the horrors they have faced. In the long term, the communities themselves also suffer from this trauma. fear and distrust take root, and people find it harder to rebuild their lives in a society that feels unsafe. The long-term insecurity that follows these kidnappings is perhaps the most worrying consequence. As more and more people are affected, communities grow increasingly distrustful, isolated, and afraid. The fabric of society begins to tear apart as people feel they can no longer rely on each other or even on the authorities meant to protect them. What was once a community of shared values, mutual respect, and security becomes a place of suspicion, tension, and fear. These kidnappings are not just crimes that impact individuals. They're crimes that destroy the sense of safety and stability that holds a community together. They are crimes that leave deep, lasting scars, not just on the victims, but on the entire country. The human cost of this epidemic is immeasurable, and until action is taken to stem the tide of abductions, these families and communities will continue to suffer the effects of this terrifying crisis. The rise in kidnappings, particularly in suburban and peri-urban areas, is not a random occurrence. It is deeply tied to the economic hardship and poverty that many Nigerians face. As the country grapples with rising inflation, joblessness, and a lack of opportunities, more and more people find themselves in desperate situations. This growing desperation creates a fertile ground for criminal gangs to recruit, manipulate, and exploit vulnerable individuals. Economic conditions have worsened in recent years, and the poor, who often have no access to basic necessities, are the ones who bear the brunt of this crisis. For many young people, the allure of joining criminal gangs or working as collaborators in kidnappings may seem like the only way to survive. The lack of jobs, coupled with the rising cost of living, pushes many towards criminal activities as a means of making money. These gangs often prey on vulnerable individuals, offering them quick cash or a sense of belonging. What's even more alarming is how these criminal networks exploit the deep economic divide. Those who are already marginalized, living on the edge of survival, are often the ones forced into these violent criminal enterprises. It's not just the economic pressures that are contributing to this rise in crime. Weak security coverage in suburban and peri-urban areas is a major factor. Many of these regions, despite their proximity to urban centers, are often poorly policed. In the face of a growing national security crisis, resources for law enforcement are stretched thin. Small, suburban communities, far from the watchful eye of city authorities, often lack the infrastructure, manpower, and intelligence capabilities needed to respond effectively to criminal activity. Without regular patrols, robust surveillance, or proper intelligence gathering, these areas become soft targets for bandits and kidnappers. The criminals know this, and they take full advantage of the lack of protection. The demand factor also plays a crucial role in perpetuating this cycle of violence. Kidnapping has become an increasingly lucrative business. The rising number of ransom payments fuels this criminal enterprise, with kidnappers realizing the enormous potential for financial gain. Criminal gangs have established networks where ransom payments run into millions, often paid by desperate families seeking the return of their loved ones. These criminals know that emotional pressure works. The desperation of families to bring their loved ones home makes ransom payments more likely. Sudan intelligence firms estimate that kidnappers demand and receive large sums each year, making abductions not just a crime of violence, but an incredibly profitable venture. The money from ransoms is then reinvested in further operations, expanding the reach of these criminal networks, making them even harder to combat. Underlying all of this is the issue of social fragmentation. In many rural and suburban areas, the lack of strong community defense or cohesion leaves people vulnerable. Criminal gangs exploit these weaknesses, targeting isolated communities that lack the resources to defend themselves. In cities, neighborhoods often have informal security networks, mutual support systems, and greater access to law enforcement. But in more isolated, rural, or suburban areas, people are on their own. Community defense is often weak, and as a result, these areas are easy pickings for kidnappers. When there is no sense of collective defense, and no effective communication or cooperation between local authorities and the community, criminals find it easier to operate undetected. This social fragmentation is more than just a lack of physical protection. It erodes the very fabric of society. Communities become fragmented, families feel disconnected, and trust in local governance deteriorates. When people are afraid to leave their homes or even sleep at night, when their children can't go to school because of the constant threat of abduction, the sense of security that is fundamental to any community starts to break down. The fear created by these kidnappings feeds into further insecurity, making it harder for communities to heal and rebuild. These underlying causes, economic hardship, weak security, the demand for ransom, and social fragmentation, have combined to create a perfect storm for the rise of kidnapping in Nigeria. The system has failed to address these issues effectively, and as a result, the country is caught in a cycle of violence that leaves families torn apart and entire communities living in fear. Until these root causes are addressed, and until both national and local governments invest in security, community defense, and economic development, this crisis will continue to escalate. These kidnappings are not just isolated incidents or individual tragedies. They represent a far deeper and more troubling breakdown of public safety, trust, and social order across Nigeria. When entire families are abducted, fathers, mothers, children, it's not just the immediate victims who suffer. The very foundation of society begins to erode. What was once a place where people felt a sense of security and normalcy now becomes a place of constant fear and uncertainty. For the families involved, the trauma is immeasurable, but for entire communities, this crisis represents a much larger problem. A society where people can no longer rely on their safety or trust in the rule of law. When entire families are at risk, the impact is devastating. No longer can people sleep peacefully in their homes. Everyday life becomes a constant nightmare, filled with anxiety and dread. Families can no longer carry out their daily routines without suspicion. Every knock on the door, every sound in the night becomes a potential threat. Simple, everyday activities that once felt safe, like going to the market, sending children to school, or sitting in your yard, now seem like dangerous acts. Homes no longer feel safe, and the sense of security that is essential to living a peaceful life is severely compromised. As communities become more fearful, they begin to lose the social cohesion that once held them together. People become isolated, hesitant to interact with their neighbors, and unwilling to trust those around them, afraid of being caught up in the same cycle of violence. But the societal impacts of these kidnappings extend beyond fear and distrust. The economic and demographic consequences are also profound. The widespread violence and insecurity have already begun to drive away investment, especially in rural areas. Local businesses that once flourished are now paralyzed by the constant threat of abduction and large-scale investments, whether in agriculture, infrastructure, or education, are being put on hold. Farmers are too afraid to tend to their crops or bring goods to market, while families in affected areas can no longer afford to send their children to school for fear of them being kidnapped. The economic stability of entire regions is being shattered, and the long-term impact on growth is becoming more pronounced with every abduction. Furthermore, these kidnappings contribute to mass migration as families, desperate to escape the violence, leave their homes in search of safer regions, or even leave the country altogether. This leads to population displacement, which only exacerbates the strain on other areas already struggling with security and resources. Communities that once thrived are now emptying out, and in their place are remnants of the social fabric that was once strong. Families who lose everything, from their homes to their livelihoods, are forced to start over, often in cities where the resources to accommodate them are already stretched thin. These events also affect future generations. Trauma from such violent acts doesn't fade quickly. It lingers, often passed down from one generation to the next. Children who witness or experience these abductions firsthand are left with psychological scars that can affect their mental health, education, and future opportunities. For many, the fear of being kidnapped or losing loved ones becomes a permanent fixture in their lives. This violence creates a ripple effect that harms not only those directly affected, but also future generations who will struggle with the legacy of insecurity and brokenness left in its wake. At a more systemic level, this crisis is testing the capacity of the state in ways that have never been more apparent. The ability of law enforcement to protect citizens, the capacity of the justice system to deter crime, and the effectiveness of community security are all being put to the test. But what we see is a system that is, more often than not, overwhelmed. Police forces are stretched thin and often lack the resources or training to deal with the sophistication of criminal networks involved in these kidnappings. The justice system struggles to keep up with the increasing caseload, and those who do get arrested for such crimes often evade justice due to corruption or insufficient evidence. Meanwhile, the government's response to the growing threat of kidnapping has often been reactive, rather than proactive, leading to a sense of failure at the highest levels. The ongoing kidnappings expose deep structural challenges in governance and protection, shedding light on how Nigeria's security apparatus has failed to evolve with the growing complexity of these crimes. The country's reliance on outdated methods of law enforcement, coupled with widespread corruption and insufficient funding, has allowed these criminal gangs to flourish unchecked. If these challenges are not addressed, the problem will only worsen, further destabilizing the country and undermining the trust citizens place in their government. In short, the rise of kidnappings for ransom is not just a problem for law enforcement to solve. It's a systemic issue that requires a fundamental rethinking of how Nigeria addresses security, social cohesion, and economic stability. These kidnappings go beyond individual families and reach into the heart of Nigeria's social, economic, and political fabric, threatening to unravel the very core of what makes a society functional. Until these deeper issues are addressed, the cycle of violence and insecurity will continue to grow, leaving lasting scars on the country's future. The kidnapping of entire families in suburban and peri-urban areas across Nigeria is no longer just a sporadic crime. It's a growing reality that is spreading like wildfire. What began as an isolated issue in certain regions has now become widespread, devastating, and alarmingly organized. Criminal gangs have taken this form of abduction to a new level, operating with precision and calculated violence, making entire communities feel vulnerable and unsafe in their own homes. What was once unimaginable, the kidnapping of mothers, fathers, and children all at once, has become an all-too-common story across the country. And this crisis, while it may feel distant to some, is something that threatens us all. As citizens, communities, and government, we can no longer afford to ignore this reality. It is time for action. It is time for us to raise our voices, demand stronger protection for the vulnerable areas that are being targeted, and ensure that no family has to live in constant fear. This is not just a law enforcement issue. It's a societal responsibility. We need to come together, as neighbors, as members of a shared community, and as citizens of Nigeria, to support the victims, demand justice for those who have been affected, and work towards a future where families can feel safe in their own homes once again. Empathy is at the heart of what we must do next. Every statistic, every number you hear about kidnappings represents a real human story. For each family that has been abducted, there is unimaginable pain, trauma, and loss. These are not just faceless victims. They are people with lives, dreams, and futures that were stolen from them in an instant. When you hear these stories, don't just see the headlines. Think about the human cost behind every kidnapping. These families need to be heard. Their stories deserve to be told. And by raising awareness, we can help ensure they are not forgotten in the wake of their suffering. Now, I ask you to reflect for a moment. Could this happen in your neighborhood? What if the nightmare of a midnight raid, the fear of being ripped away from your home, or the horror of seeing your family taken? What if that were your reality? What would you do to protect your loved ones? How can we, as a society, ensure that our children, our families, and our communities are safe? These are the tough questions that we must all grapple with as the insecurity crisis grows. The responsibility does not lie solely with the government or with law enforcement. It is a shared responsibility. Local authorities, community leaders, and individual citizens all play a role in shaping the future of safety in our neighborhoods. As we wrap up this episode, I want to leave you with the promise that this issue is far from over. It won't be solved overnight. But solutions are possible. They start with awareness, collective action, and a renewed commitment to building a safer, more secure Nigeria. In future episodes, we will dive deeper into the personal stories of those affected, speak to survivors, analyze the ransom economy, and examine the government's response to this growing crisis. We will explore possible solutions, from community-based security systems to legislative reforms, and continue to ask how we can, together, prevent more families from suffering this fate. Thank you for watching, and be sure to subscribe to Real Crime Saga for more in-depth coverage on this ongoing crisis. Together, we can make a difference.